So tonight the presentation is going to be covering what I kind of consider the most recent era of eagle patches, kind of 2000 to 2023. So we're going to be going over the type 10 up through what is currently being issued. And we'll discuss that a little bit, but I'm calling it the type 13. But we'll get into that. So first, since we're starting with the 10, kind of have to go back a little bit to the 9, but we're really not going to be covering it in all the varieties. The easiest way to tell the difference between a 9, which ended about 2000, and when the type 10 picked up, are these borders that are in the patch separating the white from the red and the blue. So I tried to put these arrows here so you can see them, but they run horizontal stitching all through here on both sides to kind of better separate the colors on the middle of the patch. And that's basically the definitive difference from the front of the eagle patch from the 9 to the 10. You can see there is no border there on the 9. I will also say as we go through these, all eagle patches, there are going to be, because it's a nationally issued rank, there are going to be some things that you get to a point where you can't categorize everything as a variety. One of the things that more or less was decided not to categorize eagles as a variety is like shading of color for most of them. So, if we're talking about these rolled edges, there may be some that are a little lighter gray or a little darker gray or something like that. We don't really categorize those as a variety. And most of what I've done is a continuation or a direct reference to the work that Terry Grove did. And we'll kind of come back to that in a little bit. So we're in the first 10. So the 10A1. So the trick for why it's the A, basically, is you have a horizontal scroll. So this means that the embroidery here in the scroll is horizontal. So it's going in, basically the direction my cursor's moving. Now, the way Terry categorized these different varieties is, he would look at, was there any difference on the front of the patch? And then, okay, those he tried to group those together, more or less. Unfortunately, I never really got to talk to him exactly of what his logic was, and it's not 100% consistent through all of his stuff, but it's fairly consistent. So what you want to do is you want to look at the front of the patch. Is there any difference? If the fronts are the same, then it kind of becomes like a sub-variety. So then you're mainly looking at the back of the patch. So like for these two, one has plastic with galls and one has plastic without galls. Now, this one, the next variety, the difference is vertical scroll. It's not perfectly vertical. When we talk about vertical scroll, it's not like we're saying, okay, it's at a perfect 90-degree angle going up. And same thing with horizontal. It's not necessarily perfectly flat. But you can look at them and tell the difference that, okay, this one is more or less vertical where the other one is horizontal. And so this would be the 10B. So the scroll is the difference in the A and the B. So then we get to the C. Now this is a little hard to see, but so this is the thick neck. It's still got the vertical scroll. If you want to see the entire detailed list for every variety, there is a table in the back of Terry's book that has that. Personally, when I'm looking at varieties, I just want to know what tells the difference. I don't need a list of everything that's the same on the patches. I just want to know the difference. And the difference is that now we're getting into 2002. So this is when they started doing the imprinted back on the plastic. So for 2002, you see it starts the Scout stuff back. Okay. And remember, this is thick neck. This is the other variety that was used in that 2002 to 2009 period. And so this is the D1, D2, which is the thin neck. And so the previous was thick, This is thin, and you have plastic back, which has that imprinted Scout stuff, with galls and without galls. So kind of think of it. Remember, we're looking at what the main variety is it's a type 10, and then we're kind of looking at where that's the type, and then the varieties, which are mainly differences on the front, and then kind of these sub varieties are the ones on the back. And you can choose what you want to collect. If you want a typeset, that's fine. If you want to go just get the main differences on the front, that's fine. If you want to go through all the backings, that's okay too. I blew this up just so you could see that I wasn't making up that they are a difference. So you got the thick neck on the left and the thin neck on the right. It is a very minor difference. As we go through these, some of these, you just have to decide what you want to collect. It is hard to see, and even I can't see it as well when I have the patch in front of me when I blow it up. So you just have to decide what you want to collect. Now, the difference is the big circular knot. So if you look at where that arrow is pointing, you see a big circular knot. I'm going to go back for a second, and you can see it's a very tight closed loop. That's the difference. Is on the 10E, it's got a big circular knot. And to be honest, these are a real pain. There is a difference in eagles that is very hard to see. And it's considered open embroidery versus closed embroidery. I don't think there are any other in the ones we'll be looking at tonight that it actually matters in determining the variety other than this one and the next one. Okay, so it's just these two. So these were made in the 2002 to 2009 period. Specifically, we believe they were made in 2009. And the reasoning was, and Ron gives a way better explanation, but basically something happened and we weren't able to use the imprinted backs for 1 year. There was some sort of like a BPA scare in China, and for whatever reason, as a result, there were no imprinted backs on anything that year, basically. There's a whole write-up on his website if you want to read it and try to understand it more. So you have these eagles that are obviously a type 10 eagle, but they don't have an imprinted back, and just looking at them, they're obviously not the very first ones that came out. They're just a little bit different construction. The open embroidery is referring to this middle white embroidery. So basically, if it is open embroidery, it is looser, and you should be able to kind of see some gaps. Okay. Now this is really small. The next variety, so this is the F, the 10F, is the exact same patch but with closed embroidery. So this embroidery in that center white area should be tighter, and you shouldn't see any gaps. It's very hard to see. And really, without having them next to each other, if you're just going off a picture in a book, it can be very difficult to tell that there is any difference. And as far as from 10 to 13, these are the only two that you need to understand that for. All the others, they may be described with these terms in the book, but you don't actually have to use those terms to determine what variety they are, if that makes sense. Because there's other things that are different, which is why I've tried to give you the short list here on the side for each variety of what you actually need to determine what it is. And you can see that they do look, if we go back for just a second, in general embroidery is just a little different from these ones that came out before. I don't know why. They just, to me, they look a little funkier. And the backs are perfectly smooth. They're not molded plastic. They're exactly like an imprinted smooth plastic back, just with no imprint on them. Okay, let's move from the type 10 into the type 11. So basically what happened is they decided to put a date on an eagle patch. They had never done a date on an eagle patch before. They had a special issue for 1 year Eagle patch, but which was for the 75th anniversary in 1985. But they had never done a date on an Eagle patch. The problem with doing a dated patch is it's really only good for 1 year. So you would think there's one variety of this. Well, there's not. There's actually 4. So there are 4 what we're going to call type 11s. The fronts are all the same. The only difference is they added the date. And you have Scout Stuff plastic back with galls and Scout Stuff plastic back without galls. So these would have been the first ones they made while they were using up the Scout Stuff backing. And then they had a new plastic back that came out, which was the 2010 BSA Centennial logo plastic back. And so that's why you have what he decided to call the B1 and B2. And this is where I say, you know, his way he listed things, it doesn't always perfectly make sense, because if you notice for the type 10s, the way he broke them up somewhat was, well, sometimes it was the front was the main difference, and then the backs were kind of like sub-varieties, where these, the only difference are in the back, but he still broke them up between the A and the B. I don't know. It gives me a little bit of headache, but it could just be me wanting consistency where he never really intended for there to be consistency there. So that's the 10s. They're not particularly hard to collect. There's just 4 different varieties you have to look for with the 2 different backings, and then with galls or without galls in each backing. So then you have the type 10 that came out after the type 11. Because you got to think, okay, we had this one patch that was issued for 1 year, so 2011 comes along. Well, we're not going to use the 2010 patches, so they go back to the old Eagle. Okay, well, that's fine. That may be the wrong photo of the back. I actually think that is. I apologize, but it's the 10H, and it should be this back on the left here. It should be the BSA plastic back with galls, which was kind of what they were using in 2010. But they went back to the front that they were using before, which was the Type 10 front, if that makes sense. And I'll check my image at the end, but that's what the descriptor is, and that is what it should be. I think when I copied the slide, I left the backing on from the previous Type 10. They went from the 10 to the 11, back to the 10, and now we're in the 12. Okay? And the 12 was once again a 1 year Eagle. They just made it for 1 year, which is what is throwing us off, is these ranks that were only made for 1 year. And it's just the date was added to it is for the 100th anniversary of Eagle Scout, and there are no known varieties. So there's only one. If you have one, you're good. But it was made for 2012, and then because that was over, they moved on to what we're calling the Type 13. So quickly to show the transition, you have the 10 on the left, and then the 11. We know we went back to the 10 for 1 year, and then we have the Type 12, and then we have what we're calling the Type 13. Now, this is where I kind of sit here and look at it, and I understand why we wanted to say it was the 13. The year was 2013, calling it the Type 13, that kind of goes together. It sounds cool. We're kind of cutting off the 10 because we're already up to the 10H. We don't need any more 10s, I guess, is the thought. But if you look at the fronts of the Eagles, between the 10 and the 13, there's really not much difference. It's not like the 9 where it went from the 9 to the 10 and they added a design element to the patch. It's not like the Type 11 or the Type 12 where they added a design element by adding the dates. There's no major difference. So, it's just kind of interesting to look at. I mean, the 13s could almost be a 10 variety, but that's not how we classified them. So we're calling them the 13s. Now, I had the ability to look at Terry's board, This is the board he put together before he passed that was not in a book yet. So it was not up to current date because it's been a while, and he was still doing research on these. So it wasn't exhaustive, but this is what he had come up with as to be the type 13 varieties. He had been working on including this in a new book and some things. Basically, you have the same front on all of them. There's no, in his, keep in mind, this is what Terry had found at the time of his passing. We've learned a couple things since then. But at that time, he said they're all the same on the front. Their only difference is the back. You have with galls, with fine mesh. I'm not sure the difference between galls and mesh, but with galls, with fine mesh, no galls, and over white paper is how he described it. Okay, what's the difference between galls and mesh?
Just so you people know, I ran a children's clothing business, and we had one of the biggest embroidery shops on the East Coast. And so when you do embroidery, the gauze that you see vertical, it's a woven material. The mesh is a non-woven material. Everyone has non-woven materials. Paper towels are non-woven. It just depends how the fibers are laid on top of one another and bonded. So when you do embroideries, you have to use something as a backing. So in this case, it was either gauze or this non-woven. So that's what he's calling the fine mesh, and you have different varieties of non-woven. When you do embroideries, you have to have something back there to support the fabric on top. So that's what the non-woven is used for. So there's various kinds. And a lot of times when you lay that plastic down on top of it, it makes the paper invisible. So it's there, and sometimes you see it, it's lighter or darker, depending upon how much of the clear fabric or plastic it absorbed. So I'll stop talking.
No, that was great. And it's possible, a lot of you may know or so, but Terry did frequently talk to the manufacturers. So he may have had knowledge that, me, when I'm looking at a patch, I don't have, but he may have talked to them about the manufacturing process, and they may have told him some of that information. So this is what Terry had on his board that I believe was good. He had drafted a book that was not published, and I believe this was what was going to be in the new book. How I've defined them is a bit different, so let's look at what I've said. So first, I found a difference on the front, and so that meant that there had to be a breakup somehow of these varieties based on that difference. And it's a difference that Terry had used before to separate things, and that was a vertical scroll versus a horizontal scroll. So for the A1 and A2, these are both vertical scroll. So, that behind the be prepared, the thread goes essentially vertically. It is the new since 1910 plastic back that came out around 2013. It was implemented for different ranks and stuff a little bit different times, but basically 2013, we started seeing this since 1910 imprinted plastic back. So we've got it with what I was calling galls on the left, and not knowing that there was an actual difference, I was calling it fine galls on the right. So that may need to be corrected to fine mesh. But, those were those two differences. And that was the A1 and the A2. And then I had the A3, which also has a vertical scroll, so same front, but it's just, you can't see any sort of galls on the back. But then we have the front difference. And if you look at these, you can really see the scroll is definitely a horizontal scroll and is not a vertical scroll. I mean, it's just not at all the same there. So then we have a since 1910 plastic back, which Ron told me, I was calling it over white originally, but Ron told me that was Pellon. And so I've got that, and then I called that the B1. So basically I defined the vertical scrolls as A and the horizontal scrolls as B. And that is simply, it more or less lines up with what Terry had, and that's just how I had them in my book. because what I would do to get these is I just randomly would go into the scout office every so often and pick up some eagles. And if I saw one that looked a little different, I'd stick it in my book. So this was just the order I had them in my book from how I picked them up. And so the one on the right with the horizontal scroll front, but with this fine gauze or mesh back, I call that the B2. The last one, I may not have called it right, and it's the newest one. I called it a B3, and my reasoning was it was a horizontal scroll. However, it is a front difference. So I might should have called it a C instead of calling it a B3. This only came out, it came out, that says 2022 on there, and that's probably right. I think it came out last year sometime. I first saw it, Ron had picked up a couple of them, and you can pick these up in your scout office near you. It's the one, all the scout offices recently I've seen. But the difference is the thick eagle. And I did a comparison just to show how different. These are sized, basically the same size image and everything. And the eagle is just noticeably thicker. And if Terry was around, I'm quite certain he would have called that a variety. I don't know if he would have called it a B3 or a C. I called it a B3 because it fell in with having a horizontal scroll like the B1 and 2 versus the vertical scroll, the A1 and A2 and A3. So, one thing I should touch on, some of these eagles come in left and right twills, and that is something that I do not classify as a variety. You can choose if you want to collect them that way or not. I've found several of these varieties and sub-varieties and things, just different ones in both left and right twill. I feel like, and I may be remembering wrong, but I feel like there was some of the earlier varieties at one point were categorized with twill direction, but none of the modern ones have been. So it's just one of those things. If you have to just decide, basically when's enough is enough. And for me, collecting them this way was enough for me. I didn't need to go into shading variations or twill directions. And really, that's everything. That brings us up to modern. Most of this up until the Type 13 is directly out of Terry's book. It's a wonderful resource. The one that I have found to be the best one for really identifying stuff is the 100 Years of the Eagle Scout Award. You can get it on Amazon. He has a pictorial history that shows all the boards he had in his collection as of the printing of the book. It doesn't show the Type 13 board, but it shows some of the other boards. And it's a great book. It's great to flip through. It tells you a lot of information. But if you're actually sitting down and you want to identify every single individual patch, personally, I think that this book, the 100 Years of the Eagle Scout Award, is actually a better book for identifying stuff than the pictorial history.